Case 1. Tony Alamo. In 1988, 12-year-old Sarah's hands were bleeding from operating industrial sewing machines 16 hours straight. Her back ached from hunching over fabric in Tony Alamo's Arkansas clothing factory, but she couldn't stop working. Around her, dozens of other children, as young as 8 years old, struggled with heavy machinery, their small fingers moving frantically to meet impossible quotas, while armed guards watched from the shadows. Sarah's mother stood nearby, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter's childhood disappear into endless labor. But she believed with absolute certainty that this suffering was God's will. Tony Alamo had convinced her that children must sacrifice their comfort, their education, and their innocence to serve the Lord's divine purpose through his ministry. This wasn't just child abuse, it was systematic exploitation orchestrated by a man who claimed to speak directly for God while building a criminal empire on the backs of innocent children, whose parents had been brainwashed into believing their suffering was sacred duty. Tony Alamo didn't start as a monster. Born Bernie Lazar Hoffman in Missouri, he reinvented himself as a charismatic preacher during the 1960s counterculture movement, attracting young runaways and hippies seeking spiritual meaning through his Susan Alamo Christian Foundation. His early ministry appeared legitimate, offering hope and community to society's forgotten youth. But by the 1980s, Alamo had transformed his religious movement into something far more sinister. He moved his followers to isolated compounds in Arkansas and California, creating closed societies where he controlled every aspect of their lives. Families surrendered their possessions, children were separated from outside influences, and questioning his authority became tantamount to rebelling against God himself. The clothing factories were Alamo's masterstroke of exploitation. His ministry operated profitable businesses, producing elaborate sequined jackets worn by celebrities like Michael Jackson and Elvis Presley. This commercial success funded his compound operations, while providing a legitimate front for the systematic abuse happening behind razor wire fences. Inside these compounds, children like Sarah worked brutal shifts in dangerous conditions while being told their labor was building God's kingdom on earth. They received no education, no medical care, and no childhood. Only endless work punctuated by Alamo's sermons about sacrifice and obedience to divine will. Parents watched their children suffer because Alamo had convinced them that resisting his commands would result in eternal damnation for their entire families. The psychological manipulation was so complete that mothers and fathers actively participated in destroying their own children's lives while believing they were ensuring their salvation. But Alamo's crimes extended far beyond child labor. He claimed divine authority to marry girls as young as 8 years old in ceremonies he called spiritual unions, but were actually legalized rape. He told parents that God had revealed these marriages as part of his special covenant, making resistance a sin against divine commandment. The systematic sexual abuse continued for years as children were told that submitting to Alamo's desires was God's plan for their lives. Those who resisted faced brutal physical punishment and psychological torture designed to break their will and ensure absolute compliance with his demands. Federal investigators eventually discovered that Alamo had taken at least 10 underage wives and regularly transported child victims across state lines to avoid local law enforcement. This interstate criminal activity brought his crimes under federal jurisdiction and violated federal trafficking laws. In 2009, a federal jury convicted Alamo on 10 counts of violating the Mann Act for transporting minors across state lines for illegal sexual purposes. Each count represented a different child victim whose innocence he had destroyed through systematic abuse, disguised as religious marriage. Federal Judge Harry Barnes sentenced Alamo to 175 years in federal prison, ensuring he would never again have the opportunity to harm children. Alamo died behind bars in 2017, ending a criminal career that had destroyed countless innocent lives through the weaponization of religious authority. Sarah and hundreds of other victims were finally free from the man who had stolen their childhoods while convincing their parents that their suffering served God's divine purpose. Welcome to Savage Case Files. If you're fascinated by true crime stories that expose the darkest betrayals of trust, subscribe now, because we're about to reveal 9 more cases that will shake your faith in religious authority forever. Case 2, Jeffrey Lundgren. Jeffrey Lundgren looked like any other devoted Mormon father when he moved his family to Kirtland, Ohio in 1984. He had served as a lay minister in the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, taught Sunday school classes, and appeared to be a man of deep spiritual conviction, seeking to strengthen his relationship with God. But behind his friendly facade, Lundgren was developing a twisted theology that would transform him from respected church member into a cold-blooded killer who convinced his followers that God demanded human sacrifice to purify their congregation. Lundgren's descent into madness began when he started claiming direct revelations from God during private prayer sessions. He told his growing circle of devoted followers that the traditional Mormon church had become corrupted and that God was speaking exclusively through him to restore pure doctrine through violent cleansing. His small splinter group gathered regularly in Kirtland, drawn by Lundgren's charismatic preaching and his claims of prophetic authority. Members included entire families who had left mainstream Mormonism to follow what they believed was God's chosen prophet in the last days before Christ's return. The Avery family, Dennis, Cheryl, and their 3 young daughters, were among Lundgren's most devoted followers. They had sold their home and moved to Kirtland specifically to be closer to their prophet, believing that following Lundgren's teachings would ensure their salvation when Christ established his earthly kingdom. But Lundgren's revelations became increasingly violent and paranoid. He claimed God was showing him that certain members of their group were spiritually contaminated and needed to be eliminated before the congregation could achieve the purity required for Christ's second coming. In twisted Bible study sessions, Lundgren used Old Testament passages about divine judgment to convince his followers that God sometimes commanded his chosen people to kill the unrighteous. He pointed to stories of Moses ordering the deaths of idol worshippers and Joshua destroying entire cities as proof that holy violence was sometimes necessary. The Avery family became Lundgren's primary targets when he declared that God had revealed they were spiritually impure and their presence was preventing the entire group from receiving divine blessings. He claimed their elimination was necessary to prepare the way for Christ's return to earth. On April 17, 1989, Lundgren ordered his male followers to dig a grave in the barn behind his Kirtland farmhouse. He told them they were preparing for a special ceremony that would cleanse their congregation and bring them closer to God's divine presence. That evening, Lundgren invited the unsuspecting Avery family to his home for what they believed would be a special religious service. Dennis, Cheryl, and their 3 daughters arrived dressed in their finest clothes, honored that their prophet had chosen them for what he described as a sacred spiritual experience. One by one, Lundgren's followers lured each family member into the barn where they were bound and gagged. Under Lundgren's direct orders, his male followers systematically executed Dennis, Cheryl, 15-year-old Trina, 13-year-old Rebecca, and 6-year-old Karen with duct tape and gunshots. The murders were carried out with methodical precision as Lundgren stood over the proceedings, claiming that each death was a holy sacrifice commanded by God to purify their congregation. His followers participated because they genuinely believed they were serving divine purposes under their prophet's guidance. After the executions, Lundgren led his followers in prayers, thanking God for allowing them to participate in this sacred cleansing. They buried the family in the pre-dug grave, while Lundgren proclaimed that their congregation was now pure enough to receive the special revelations that would prepare them for Christ's kingdom. The group fled to West Virginia, where they lived in hiding for months before federal investigators tracked them down. During their capture, several followers confessed to their participation in the murders, while explaining that they had acted under divine commandment from their prophet. Lundgren was convicted of 5 counts of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. Several of his followers received life sentences for their participation in the killings. Lundgren was executed by lethal injection in 2006, finally paying for his manipulation of religious authority to commit unspeakable evil. The Avery family's brutal murder remains one of the most shocking examples of how charismatic religious leaders can convince otherwise normal people to commit horrific crimes in God's name. Case 3. Warren Jeffs. In the isolated desert communities of Utah and Arizona, Warren Jeffs wielded absolute power over more than 10,000 followers of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. To his devoted believers, Jeffs wasn't just a religious leader, he was God's prophet on earth, holding the keys to their eternal salvation and the power to determine every aspect of their earthly existence. Jeffs had inherited this divine authority from his father, Rulon Jeffs, who had led the FLDS community for decades while practicing polygamy and arranging marriages for his followers. When Warren assumed control in 2002, he immediately expanded his father's authoritarian system into something far more sinister and sexually predatory. The FLDS community operated like a closed society where questioning the prophet's commands was equivalent to rebelling against God himself. Families lived in multi-generational compounds. Children received limited education, focused on religious obedience, and contact with the outside world was strictly forbidden to maintain spiritual purity. Jeffs transformed this isolated environment into his personal hunting ground for child victims, using his prophetic authority to arrange spiritual marriages between himself and underage girls, while forcing other young females into marriages with older male followers who served his criminal enterprise. 12-year-old Marianne Jessup was chosen by Jeffs to become one of his spiritual wives in a ceremony he claimed was commanded directly by God. Her parents, deeply indoctrinated into FLDS theology, were told that resisting the prophet's marriage assignment would result in their family's eternal damnation and immediate expulsion from their community. The psychological manipulation was so complete that Marianne's mother helped prepare her daughter for what she believed was a sacred spiritual union, even as every maternal instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong with marrying her child to a man in his 50s. Jeffs convinced parents throughout the FLDS community that surrendering their daughters for his sexual gratification was the ultimate test of faith and obedience to divine will. He claimed these marriages were necessary to create a pure bloodline that would populate God's kingdom during the coming apocalypse. Male followers became unwilling accomplices to systematic child rape, as Jeffs assigned them underage wives while threatening spiritual consequences for anyone who questioned his marriage arrangements. These men participated in the abuse because they genuinely believed their prophet spoke for God and that disobedience meant eternal punishment. The FLDS community's geographic isolation helped conceal the systematic sexual abuse from law enforcement agencies. Children were taught that police and government officials were agents of Satan trying to destroy God's chosen people, making them unlikely to report abuse even if they recognized it as criminal. Jeffs used his control over housing assignments, family relationships, and economic opportunities to ensure absolute compliance with his sexual demands. Followers who questioned his authority faced immediate banishment from the community, losing their homes, families, and entire social support systems overnight. As law enforcement agencies began investigating reports of underage marriages within the FLDS community, Jeffs went into hiding while continuing to control his followers through recorded messages and intermediaries. He remained on the FBI's 10 most wanted list for months while orchestrating additional child marriages from his secret locations. In 2006, Jeffs was finally captured during a routine traffic stop in Nevada, ending his fugitive status but not his control over the FLDS community. Even from jail, he continued issuing prophecies and marriage assignments to his devoted followers, who remained convinced of his divine authority. During his trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of Jeff's systematic sexual abuse of children, including recorded conversations where he gave explicit instructions about sexual acts with his underage wives, while claiming these activities were commanded by God for their spiritual development. The evidence included DNA proof that Jeffs had fathered children with underage girls, recorded ceremonies where he married children as young as 12, and testimony from escaped FLDS members who described the systematic sexual exploitation happening within their community under the guise of religious marriage. In 2011, a Texas jury convicted Jeffs of sexual assault of children and sentenced him to life in prison plus 20 years. The conviction represented justice for dozens of child victims whose innocence had been destroyed by a man who weaponized religious authority to satisfy his pedophile desires. Even from his prison cell, Jeffs continues to control many FLDS followers who still believe he is God's prophet and that his imprisonment is persecution for practicing true religion. His criminal legacy demonstrates how absolute religious authority can enable systematic child abuse on an industrial scale. Case 4. David Berg. David Brant Berg appeared to be an idealistic young minister when he began working with hippies and runaways in California during the late 1960s. His early outreach to society's outcasts seemed genuinely compassionate, offering food, shelter, and spiritual guidance to young people who had been rejected by mainstream society and traditional churches. But Berg's ministry, initially called Teens for Christ and later renamed the Children of God, quickly evolved into something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. What began as a Christian commune dedicated to helping troubled youth became a sophisticated international sex trafficking operation that systematically abused children across multiple continents. Berg claimed to receive direct revelations from God through spiritual letters he called Mo letters, named after his adopted prophet persona, Moses David. These writings, which he distributed to thousands of followers worldwide, contained increasingly explicit sexual instructions that he claimed were divine commandments for establishing God's kingdom on earth. The most devastating doctrine Berg introduced was called flirty fishing, a practice that required female followers to use sexual encounters as a recruitment tool for gaining new converts and financial supporters. Berg claimed God had revealed that sexual intimacy was a form of divine love that could win souls for Christ and support the ministry's worldwide mission. Women in the Children of God were commanded to approach potential converts in bars, hotels, and other locations, using their sexuality to establish relationships that would supposedly lead to spiritual conversion and financial donations. This practice was presented as the highest form of Christian service, rather than the prostitution it actually represented. Karen Elvis Smith joined the Children of God as an 18-year-old seeking spiritual purpose after a troubled childhood. She initially felt welcomed into a loving community that seemed to offer the family structure she had never experienced, but she quickly discovered that Berg's theology required her to participate in sexual activities that violated every moral principle she had been taught. Berg's manipulation tactics were sophisticated and systematic. He isolated followers from their families, controlled their access to information about the outside world, and used biblical interpretation to justify practices that would be clearly recognized as abuse in any other context. Members who questioned his sexual doctrines were accused of lacking faith and threatened with spiritual damnation. The Children of God operated compounds in dozens of countries, making it difficult for law enforcement agencies to track their activities or protect the victims being abused within their closed communities. Berg himself lived as a fugitive, constantly moving between hideouts while issuing sexual commands to his followers through his Mo letters. But Berg's most horrific crime was the systematic sexual abuse of children within the Children of God communities. He claimed that children needed sexual education and experience to develop properly, using this twisted logic to justify widespread pedophilia that destroyed the innocence of thousands of young victims. Berg's writings explicitly encouraged sexual contact between adults and children, claiming that traditional age restrictions were artificial barriers imposed by a corrupt society that didn't understand God's true design for human sexuality. Parents within the cult were instructed to allow and even participate in the sexual abuse of their own children. The children born into the Children of God communities had no protection from the systematic sexual exploitation that Berg claimed was part of their spiritual education. They were taught that resisting adult sexual advances was disobedience to God, and that their abuse was actually divine love that would prepare them for their roles in God's kingdom. Former members who escaped the Children of God began speaking publicly about the widespread sexual abuse they had witnessed and experienced within Berg's communities. Their testimonies revealed an international network of child exploitation operating under the protection of religious freedom, claims, and geographic isolation. Law enforcement agencies in multiple countries launched investigations into the Children of God's activities, but Berg's fugitive lifestyle and the organization's international structure made prosecution extremely difficult. He continued issuing sexual commands through his writings while hiding in secret locations that his followers funded through prostitution and other criminal activities. Berg died in 1994 while living as a fugitive in Portugal, never facing justice for the thousands of children whose lives he had destroyed through his twisted sexual theology. His death ended the most extreme phases of abuse within the organization, but the trauma he inflicted on multiple generations of victims continues to impact families worldwide. The Children of God eventually reformed and publicly apologized for the abuse that occurred under Berg's leadership, but the organization's legacy demonstrates how religious authority can be weaponized to commit systematic sexual exploitation on an international scale while avoiding accountability through geographic mobility and spiritual manipulation. Case 5. Marshall Applewhite. Marshall Applewhite seemed like an unlikely cult leader when he first began preaching his bizarre theology in the 1970s. A former music professor with a background in classical performance, Applewhite had struggled with his sexuality and mental health before finding his calling as a self-proclaimed messenger from an alien civilization that existed beyond human comprehension. Together with his partner Bonnie Lou Nettles, Applewhite developed a unique religious doctrine that combined Christian theology with science fiction elements, claiming that Earth was merely a temporary training ground for souls preparing to graduate to a higher level of existence among the stars. Their movement, eventually called Heaven's Gate, attracted followers who felt alienated from traditional society and were seeking a deeper spiritual purpose. Applewhite and Nettles, who called themselves the Two, convinced believers that they were extraterrestrial beings sent to guide chosen souls toward evolutionary advancement beyond human limitations. The Heaven's Gate community lived in strict isolation, following rigid rules about diet, sexuality, and social interaction that were designed to purify their earthly vassals for the coming transformation. Members surrendered their possessions, severed contact with family members, and dedicated themselves completely to preparing for what they believed would be their graduation from human existence. Applewhite's control over his followers was absolute and all-consuming. Members wore identical clothing, maintained similar haircuts, and spoke in the technical, emotionless language that their leader used to describe their cosmic mission. They believed that expressing individual personality or desires would interfere with their spiritual evolution. When Bonnie Nettles died of cancer in 1985, Applewhite claimed that she had successfully completed her earthly mission and was waiting for him and their followers on the spaceship that would transport them to the next level of existence. Her death intensified his urgency about completing their cosmic mission before it was too late. The group supported themselves through various business ventures, including a web design company called Higher Source, while living communally in rented houses where they practiced the strict disciplines that Applewhite claimed were necessary for their spiritual transformation. To outsiders, they appeared to be a harmless religious community focused on self-improvement and spiritual growth. But Applewhite's theology took a deadly turn when he became convinced that the Hale-Bopp comet, which appeared in the night sky during 1996 and 1997, was actually the spacecraft that had come to collect him and his followers for their graduation to the next level of existence. He claimed to receive revelations that Earth was about to be recycled and that their only chance for survival was to leave their physical bodies behind and join the aliens who were traveling behind the comet. This process, which he called graduation, required his followers to commit suicide in order to free their souls for the cosmic journey. Applewhite's manipulation of his followers' deepest spiritual longings made them willing participants in what would become the largest mass suicide in American history. They believed with absolute certainty that death was not an ending, but a necessary transition to a higher form of existence. On March 26, 1997, 39 members of Heaven's Gate, including Applewhite himself, consumed lethal doses of phenobarbital mixed with vodka and covered their faces with plastic bags to ensure death by asphyxiation. They died in shifts over several days in their rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California. The victims ranged in age from 26 to 72, including computer programmers, nurses, and other professionals who had abandoned successful careers to follow Applewhite's promise of cosmic evolution. They left behind detailed videotaped messages explaining their decision and expressing their excitement about joining the spacecraft they believed was hidden behind Hale-Bopp. The discovery of 39 bodies dressed in identical black clothing and Nike sneakers shocked the world and exposed the deadly consequences of Applewhite's sophisticated psychological manipulation. Police found detailed suicide instructions and evidence that the deaths had been carefully planned and coordinated over several months. The Heaven's Gate tragedy demonstrated how intelligent, educated people could be convinced to surrender their lives to a leader who promised spiritual advancement through death. Applewhite had successfully weaponized his followers' desire for meaning and transcendence, turning their deepest spiritual longings into instruments of their own destruction. Family members of the victims struggled to understand how their loved ones had become so completely controlled by Applewhite's bizarre theology that they willingly chose death over continuing their earthly relationships. The mass suicide left behind dozens of devastated families who had lost their relatives to a man's delusions of cosmic grandeur. Case 6. James Arthur Ray. James Arthur Ray built his reputation as one of America's most successful self-help gurus by promising wealthy clients that he could unlock their unlimited potential through intensive spiritual experiences that would transform them into spiritual warriors, capable of conquering any challenge in life or business. Ray's seminars attracted celebrities, executives, and affluent professionals willing to pay thousands of dollars for his trademarked programs that combined New Age spirituality with aggressive personal development techniques. His books became bestsellers, his appearances on Oprah made him a household name, and his seminars regularly sold out as people sought his promise of radical personal transformation. The centerpiece of Ray's empire was his Spiritual Warrior Retreat, a grueling 5-day program in Sedona, Arizona that cost participants $9,695 each and promised to push them beyond their physical and psychological limits to achieve breakthrough personal growth through extreme spiritual challenges. Ray marketed himself as a modern shaman who could guide successful people through ancient rituals that would unlock hidden power within their souls. He claimed expertise in Native American traditions while appropriating sacred ceremonies for his commercial purposes, promising participants that surviving his intense programs would make them unstoppable in every area of their lives. The October 2009 Spiritual Warrior Retreat followed Ray's typical pattern of psychological manipulation and physical stress. Participants were subjected to days of food deprivation, sleep restriction, and grueling physical challenges designed to break down their psychological defenses and make them completely dependent on his guidance for survival. 56 participants had paid nearly $10,000 each to attend the retreat, believing that Ray's extreme methods would help them overcome personal limitations and achieve the success they desired. Many were successful professionals who felt stuck in their careers and relationships despite their material achievements. The retreat's culminating event was a sweat lodge ceremony that Ray claimed was based on authentic Native American purification rituals. He constructed a makeshift lodge using tarps and heated it with red-hot volcanic rocks, creating a sauna-like environment that he promised would purify participants' spirits through intense physical ordeal. But Ray's sweat lodge was a dangerous imitation of traditional ceremonies that he neither understood nor respected. Native American spiritual leaders had spent years learning the precise protocols necessary to conduct safe sweat lodge ceremonies, knowledge that Ray completely lacked despite his claims of shamanic authority. On October 8, 2009, Ray packed 56 people into his poorly constructed sweat lodge for what he called the final test of their spiritual warrior training. The overcrowded conditions and extreme heat created a deadly environment that traditional practitioners would have recognized as dangerous and avoided. As temperatures inside the lodge reached dangerous levels, participants began collapsing from heat exhaustion and dehydration. But Ray commanded them to remain inside, claiming that their discomfort was merely psychological weakness that they needed to overcome to achieve spiritual breakthrough. Kirby Brown, a 38-year-old life coach from New York, was among the participants who began showing signs of severe heat distress as Ray continued demanding that everyone remain in the lodge despite the obvious medical emergencies developing around them. She had paid thousands of dollars believing that Ray's program would help her expand her coaching business and personal relationships. James Shore, a 40-year-old businessman from Milwaukee, also began experiencing dangerous symptoms as the temperature inside Ray's makeshift lodge exceeded safe levels. Like other participants, he had been psychologically conditioned through days of deprivation to trust Ray's authority over his own survival instincts. Ray ignored the obvious signs of medical emergencies developing inside his sweat lodge, instead encouraging participants to push through their physical distress as part of their spiritual development. He claimed that accepting discomfort was necessary for achieving the personal transformation they had paid him to provide. When participants finally began collapsing unconscious, Ray initially refused to allow medical attention, claiming that their conditions were spiritual rather than medical emergencies. Only when it became obvious that people were dying did he finally permit emergency responders to enter his lodge. Kirby Brown, James Shore, and Liz Newman died from hyperthermia and dehydration caused by Ray's reckless disregard for basic safety protocols. 18 other participants required emergency medical treatment for heat injuries that could have been easily prevented through proper supervision and safety measures. Ray was charged with 3 counts of negligent homicide and convicted in 2011, after prosecutors demonstrated that his reckless conduct had directly caused the deaths. He served nearly 2 years in prison, a sentence that many victims' families felt was inadequate for the lives he had destroyed through his dangerous spiritual theater. Case 7. Lamore Whitehead. Bishop Lamore Whitehead loved to flash his wealth during Sunday sermons at his Leaders of Tomorrow International Ministries church in Brooklyn. Dressed in designer suits, Gucci loafers, and expensive jewelry, he preached the prosperity gospel, while driving luxury cars and living in a lavish lifestyle that he claimed was evidence of God's blessing on his faithful ministry. Whitehead positioned himself as more than just a local pastor. He was a political powerhouse with claimed connections to New York City Mayor Eric Adams and other influential figures. He used these supposed relationships to build credibility with his congregation, convincing them that his success came from divine favor and political influence that could benefit anyone who followed his spiritual guidance. His church attracted members from Brooklyn's working-class communities who were struggling financially and hoped that Whitehead's prosperity teachings could help them achieve the wealth and success he displayed so prominently during his flamboyant services. Whitehead's sermons combined traditional religious themes with promises of material prosperity for followers who demonstrated sufficient faith through generous donations to his ministry. He claimed that God wanted his people to be wealthy and that poverty was a sign of insufficient spiritual commitment to divine principles. But behind the designer clothing and luxury lifestyle, Whitehead was operating sophisticated fraud schemes that targeted the very people who trusted him most: elderly congregants who believed their pastor would protect their financial interests while helping them grow closer to God. Pauline Anderson was an 86-year-old retired teacher who had faithfully attended Whitehead's church for years, trusting her bishop's spiritual authority and believing in his promises that smart investments could multiply her retirement savings while supporting God's work through his ministry. When Whitehead approached Anderson about investing her life savings in what he described as a guaranteed real estate opportunity that would provide substantial returns while funding church expansion projects, she didn't hesitate to trust her spiritual leader with her financial future. Anderson gave Whitehead $90,000, her entire life savings accumulated through decades of careful budgeting on a teacher's salary. She believed she was making a smart investment that would secure her financial future while supporting her church's mission to help others achieve prosperity through faith. But instead of investing Anderson's money in legitimate real estate ventures, Whitehead immediately diverted the funds to support his own lavish lifestyle. He used her retirement savings to purchase luxury clothing, expensive jewelry, and other personal items, while lying about the investment's performance. When Anderson asked about returns on her investment, Whitehead provided fraudulent documentation, claiming her money was earning substantial profits in real estate ventures that existed only in his imagination. He convinced her to be patient while her investment supposedly grew, knowing he had already spent her life savings. The fraud continued for months, as Whitehead maintained his wealthy appearance through stealing from elderly parishioners who trusted his spiritual authority. He preached about God's blessings while systematically robbing the people who believed he was their spiritual protector. Whitehead's criminal activities extended beyond defrauding his own congregation. Federal investigators discovered that he had attempted to extort $5,000 from a businessman by threatening to use his alleged political connections to interfere with the victim's business operations unless he received payment. During recorded conversations with the extortion victim, Whitehead claimed he could influence government decisions affecting the businessman's ventures and demanded money in exchange for his protection. These recordings provided federal prosecutors with clear evidence of his criminal intent and methods. When the FBI arrested Whitehead in 2022, they discovered that his entire prosperity ministry was built on fraud and deception. The wealth he displayed as evidence of God's favor was actually stolen from elderly believers who had sacrificed their financial security to support what they thought was legitimate religious ministry. During his 2024 federal trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of Whitehead's systematic fraud against vulnerable elderly victims who had trusted their spiritual leader with their life savings. The evidence included financial records, recorded conversations, and victim testimony that exposed his criminal enterprise. Anderson testified about losing her entire retirement fund to a man she had trusted as God's representative in her life. Her emotional testimony revealed how religious fraud doesn't just steal money, it destroys elderly victims' faith, security, and ability to support themselves during their most vulnerable years. Federal Judge Lorna Schofield sentenced Whitehead to 9 years in prison for wire fraud, extortion, and making false statements to federal investigators. The sentence reflected the severity of his crimes against elderly victims who had trusted him with their spiritual and financial welfare. The Bling bishop's conviction demonstrated how prosperity gospel preachers can weaponize religious authority to commit sophisticated fraud against the very people they claim to serve, destroying lives while funding their own lavish lifestyles through systematic theft, disguised as spiritual investment. Case 8. Gerald Payne. Gerald Payne understood exactly how to exploit the intersection of faith and greed when he launched Greater Ministries International in 1996. Presenting himself as a devout Christian businessman who had discovered God's secret formula for miraculous financial returns, Payne promised investors that their money would be blessed and multiplied through divine intervention that guaranteed enormous profits. His ministry operated from a sprawling compound in rural Florida, where Payne held revival-style meetings that combined passionate religious preaching with sophisticated investment presentations. He claimed that God had revealed to him ancient biblical principles that could generate guaranteed returns of 100 to 200% annually for faithful Christian investors. Payne's theological justification for his investment program centered on Jesus' parable of the talents, which he interpreted as God's commandment for Christians to multiply their money through faithful stewardship. He taught that investors who trusted his ministry with their funds were demonstrating biblical obedience that would be rewarded with miraculous financial blessings. The Greater Ministries investment program attracted thousands of evangelical Christians who were struggling financially and desperately wanted to believe that their faith could solve their material problems. Payne specifically targeted elderly believers, retired individuals, and others who needed their investments to succeed in order to maintain their standard of living. Robert and Helen Martinez were devout Christians from Texas who had saved $47,000 for their retirement after decades of working in blue-collar jobs. When they heard Payne's presentations about faith-based investing that promised to double their money within months, they believed God was providing a miraculous solution to their financial insecurity. Payne's ministry materials included biblical quotations, testimonials from supposedly successful investors, and elaborate explanations of how divine principles could override normal economic laws to generate supernatural returns. The presentations were carefully designed to appeal to people whose religious faith made them want to believe in miraculous financial solutions. The Martinez family sent their entire life savings to Greater Ministries after attending one of Payne's revival meetings where he preached passionately about God's desire to bless faithful Christians with abundant prosperity. They believed they were participating in God's plan for their financial security while supporting legitimate Christian ministry. But Greater Ministries was actually a massive Ponzi scheme that used new investors' money to pay earlier participants while Payne diverted millions into personal accounts and lavish lifestyle expenses. No legitimate investments existed. The entire operation was built on deception and the systematic theft of money from trusting believers. Payne lived extravagantly on his investors' money while maintaining his image as a humble servant of God who was helping Christians achieve financial prosperity through faithful stewardship. He purchased luxury homes, expensive cars, and other assets, while his victims believed their money was growing through divine intervention. When early investors requested withdrawals, Payne paid them using funds from new participants, while claiming their profits came from successful investments blessed by God. This created powerful testimonials that convinced additional victims to invest their life savings in what they believed was a divinely guaranteed financial opportunity. The scheme continued growing as Payne expanded his recruitment efforts through Christian media, traveling revival meetings, and word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied early investors who didn't realize their profits came from later victims rather than legitimate investment returns. By 1999, Greater Ministries had collected over $500 million from approximately 18,000 investors who believed they were participating in God's plan for Christian financial prosperity. The scale of the fraud made it one of the largest religious investment schemes in American history. Federal investigators began examining Greater Ministries when the scheme's mathematics became unsustainable and Payne could no longer pay promised returns to all investors simultaneously. The investigation revealed that no legitimate investments had ever existed and that investor funds had been systematically stolen for Payne's personal use. When the scheme collapsed in 1999, thousands of elderly Christians lost their entire life savings to a man who had convinced them that investing with his ministry was an act of faith that God would reward with miraculous returns. Many victims faced poverty and financial ruin in their retirement years because they had trusted their spiritual leader with their life savings. The Martinez family lost their $47,000 retirement fund and were forced to continue working into their 70s because they could no longer afford to retire. Their experience was repeated thousands of times as elderly believers discovered their faith-based investments had been stolen by the minister they trusted. Federal prosecutors charged Payne with racketeering, fraud, and money laundering for operating the massive Ponzi scheme disguised as Christian ministry. During his 2001 trial, evidence revealed the systematic theft of over $500 million from believers who had trusted his claims about divinely guaranteed investment returns. Payne was convicted on multiple federal charges and sentenced to 27 years in prison for his role in orchestrating one of the largest religious fraud schemes in history. His conviction provided some justice for thousands of elderly victims whose retirement security had been destroyed by his weaponization of religious faith for criminal profit. Case 9. Isaac Ochieng. In the sprawling slums of Nairobi, where poverty creates desperate conditions that make people vulnerable to exploitation, Bishop Isaac Ochieng built his ministry on a twisted theology that would transform faithful young believers into a criminal gang operating under the cover of religious devotion. Ochieng's church attracted unemployed youth from Kenya's urban slums who were struggling to survive in an economy that offered few legitimate opportunities for advancement. These young men came to his services seeking spiritual guidance and hope for their futures, but they found something far more dangerous than traditional religious teaching. The bishop preached a prosperity gospel specifically designed to appeal to desperate young people who had grown up watching wealthy Kenyans live in luxury while their own families struggled to afford basic necessities. He claimed that God wanted his faithful children to be prosperous and that poverty was a sign of insufficient commitment to divine principles. But Ochieng's version of prosperity theology included a criminal element that transformed religious obligation into criminal enterprise. He taught his young followers that God would bless them with wealth only if they proved their faith by bringing him money, regardless of how they obtained it. During passionate sermons delivered to packed congregations of unemployed youth, Ochieng claimed that traditional methods of earning money were too slow for God's chosen people. He taught that the faithful should use any means necessary to acquire resources for God's work, including theft from those who had been blessed with material wealth. The bishop's theological justification for theft was sophisticated and compelling to young people who felt abandoned by society and desperate for divine intervention in their circumstances. He claimed that wealthy Kenyans had gained their money through corruption and exploitation, making it morally acceptable for God's people to redistribute that wealth through whatever means necessary. Samuel Mwangi was an 18-year-old from Kibera, one of Nairobi's largest slums, who had grown up watching his family struggle to afford food and shelter while politicians and business leaders lived in luxury mansions. When he began attending Ochieng's church, he found a community that seemed to understand his anger about economic inequality. Ochieng specifically targeted young men like Samuel who were intelligent, desperate, and angry about their economic circumstances. He convinced them that God had chosen them to be instruments of divine justice, who would take from the wealthy and give to his ministry, which represented God's kingdom on earth. The bishop's criminal recruitment process was gradual and psychologically sophisticated. He began by teaching general principles about God's desire for his people to prosper, then gradually introduced the idea that traditional employment was insufficient for achieving the wealth that God intended for his faithful servants. During private meetings with selected young followers, Ochieng provided specific instructions about theft techniques and target selection. He taught them to view stealing as a form of spiritual warfare against the economic systems that had oppressed their families and communities. The young men who participated in Ochieng's theft operations genuinely believed they were serving God's purposes by redistributing wealth from corrupt rich people to their bishop's ministry. The religious justification made them feel righteous about criminal activities that they would normally have recognized as morally wrong. Ochieng's criminal network operated for months as his young followers brought him stolen money, electronics, and other valuable items that they had taken from homes, businesses, and individuals throughout Nairobi. The bishop presented their criminal proceeds as offerings that demonstrated their faith and commitment to God's work. The theft ring was discovered in 2019 when Kenyan police arrested several young men during a burglary and discovered that they were carrying religious materials and claiming their criminal activities were commanded by their spiritual leader. Their confessions led investigators directly to Ochieng's church. When police raided the bishop's compound, they found stolen goods worth thousands of dollars, along with evidence that Ochieng had been systematically training young followers to commit theft, while convincing them their crimes were acts of religious devotion that would be blessed by God. The arrested young men provided detailed testimony about how Ochieng had convinced them that stealing was a form of spiritual service that would bring them divine blessings and help their families escape poverty. Their statements revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation the bishop had used to transform faithful believers into criminal accomplices. Ochieng was charged with incitement to commit crimes and handling stolen property, crimes that carried significant prison sentences under Kenyan law. The charges reflected the serious nature of his exploitation of religious authority to create a criminal enterprise staffed by vulnerable young people. The case highlighted how poverty and religious desperation can be weaponized by criminal leaders, who understand how to exploit economic inequality and spiritual hunger to convince followers to commit crimes they would never consider under normal circumstances. During his trial, prosecutors demonstrated how Ochieng had systematically corrupted young people's religious faith, transforming their desire to serve God into willingness to commit theft on his behalf. The evidence revealed a criminal conspiracy disguised as ministry that had destroyed multiple young lives while enriching their spiritual leader. The Kenyan theft ring demonstrated how religious authority can be used to exploit economic desperation and transform faithful young believers into criminal accomplices who genuinely believe their illegal activities serve divine purposes. Case 10. Wayne Bent. In the remote mountains of northern New Mexico, Wayne Bent transformed from a failed Seventh-day Adventist pastor into something far more dangerous, a self-proclaimed Messiah who convinced his isolated followers that sexual contact with their children was necessary for salvation and spiritual purification. Bent had been expelled from the Seventh-day Adventist Church for his increasingly radical interpretations of biblical prophecy, but rather than accepting this rejection, he gathered a small group of devoted followers who believed his claims that God was speaking exclusively through him during the final days before Christ's return to earth. His ministry, called the Lord Our Righteousness Church, established a compound called Strong City in the New Mexico wilderness, where approximately 50 followers lived in complete isolation from the outside world, while preparing for what Bent claimed would be the end of human civilization and the beginning of God's kingdom. Bent's theological evolution from traditional Christianity to dangerous cultism accelerated when he began claiming direct divine revelations that contradicted established biblical teachings about morality, family relationships, and appropriate conduct between adults and children within their religious community. The most destructive element of Bent's twisted theology was his teaching that he, as the returned Christ, needed to engage in intimate physical contact with his followers, including children, to prepare them spiritually for the coming apocalypse and ensure their salvation during God's final judgment. Bent convinced parents within his isolated community that allowing him unrestricted access to their children was the ultimate test of their faith and obedience to divine will. He claimed that traditional moral boundaries were artificial restrictions that had been imposed by a corrupt world that didn't understand God's true intentions for human relationships. Sarah Montoya was 16 years old when her parents brought their family to live at Strong City after becoming convinced that Wayne Bent was indeed the returned Messiah who could provide salvation during the approaching end times. Her parents believed they were protecting their daughter by bringing her to a pure Christian community, led by God's chosen prophet. But within Bent's isolated compound, Sarah discovered that her supposed spiritual protector was actually a predator who used his claimed divine authority to justify sexual contact that violated every moral principle she had been taught throughout her childhood and adolescence. Bent's manipulation of parents within his community was so complete that they willingly allowed him private access to their daughters while believing they were demonstrating ultimate faith in his divine authority. The psychological control he exercised over families made parents complicit in their own children's sexual abuse. The abuse continued for years because Bent's followers genuinely believed that questioning his conduct would be equivalent to questioning God himself. Parents, who might normally have protected their children from sexual predators, instead facilitated the abuse because their spiritual leader had convinced them it was necessary for their family's salvation. Bent claimed that his intimate contact with underage girls was part of a divine purification process that would prepare them for the coming kingdom of God. He used biblical language and religious imagery to disguise criminal sexual abuse as sacred ritual that parents should feel honored to have their daughters experience. The isolation of Strong City helped conceal Bent's systematic abuse from law enforcement agencies and child protection services. The compound's remote location and the followers' distrust of outside authorities created perfect conditions for ongoing criminal activity without detection or intervention. But in 2008, state authorities received reports about inappropriate sexual contact between Bent and underage girls within his religious community. The allegations triggered investigations that exposed the systematic abuse happening under the cover of religious freedom and spiritual authority. When investigators interviewed former members who had escaped from Strong City, they discovered disturbing accounts of Bent's sexual exploitation of multiple underage girls whose parents had been convinced that his conduct was divinely mandated rather than criminal abuse. The investigation revealed that Bent had used his claimed messianic identity to convince parents that sexual contact with their daughters was a sacred privilege that would ensure their family's salvation. This theological manipulation made families complicit in facilitating their own children's abuse. During his trial, prosecutors presented evidence that Bent had engaged in sexual contact with minors while claiming divine authority for his actions. The case demonstrated how religious leaders can weaponize spiritual authority to commit crimes that devastate children, while convincing their parents that abuse is actually divine blessing. In 2008, Bent was convicted of criminal sexual contact with a minor and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The court sentenced him to 18 years in prison, ensuring that he could no longer use claimed divine authority to sexually exploit vulnerable children within isolated religious communities. The Strong City case revealed how self-proclaimed religious leaders can create closed communities where criminal abuse flourishes under the protection of spiritual authority and parental manipulation that transforms protective instincts into complicity with predatory behavior. 10 cases. 10 corrupted shepherds. Thousands of lives destroyed. What we've witnessed isn't just a collection of individual crimes, it's a devastating pattern that reveals how religious authority becomes the perfect weapon for sophisticated predators who understand that faith creates vulnerability unlike anything else in human experience. These weren't random acts of violence or greed. They were systematic exploitation schemes that specifically targeted the most sacred human need, the desire for spiritual meaning and divine connection. Every perpetrator weaponized their followers' deepest beliefs to commit crimes that would have been impossible in any other context. These crimes were particularly devastating because they destroyed more than just property or even lives. They shattered the fundamental human capacity for trust in spiritual authority. Victims didn't just lose money or suffer physical harm. They lost their ability to believe in the divine guidance that had provided meaning and purpose to their existence. Perhaps most troubling is how these criminals exploited the noblest human impulses, the desire to serve God, help others, and find meaning beyond material existence. They transformed faith, generosity, and spiritual hunger into weapons that destroyed the very people seeking divine connection. The institutional failures revealed by these cases are massive and systemic. Religious freedom protections, designed to prevent government interference with legitimate spiritual practice, were exploited to shield criminal enterprises from scrutiny. Churches and denominations repeatedly prioritized institutional reputation over victim protection. These cases demonstrate that unchecked religious authority is inherently dangerous, regardless of the leader's stated beliefs or denominational affiliations. From Christian fundamentalists to New Age gurus to self-proclaimed messiahs, the pattern remained consistent. Absolute spiritual power corrupts absolutely. Which of these cases shocked you most? Share your thoughts in the comments about how we can better protect believers from predatory religious leaders who use spiritual authority as a weapon against the innocent. What warning signs should families watch for when evaluating religious communities and spiritual teachers? Your insights could help other viewers recognize manipulation tactics before they become victims of similar exploitation schemes, disguised as ministry and divine guidance. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more true crime investigations that expose the dark side of trusted institutions. We bring you the stories that reveal how power corrupts in the most unexpected places, from religious compounds to corporate boardrooms. Thanks for watching Savage Case Files, where we never stop digging for the truth behind society's most shocking betrayals of trust.